Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Nacho Tuesday. And today I have Matt here with YourICP. And without further ado, we would love if you could introduce yourself and your company.
Yeah, absolutely. So Matt McKinnon, I'm the COO and co-founder of YourICP. Think of YourICP as that trust layer between the go-to-market platforms and the data sources, right? So, obviously when you're talking go-to-market teams, whether you have an SDR team, BDRs that are outreaching to respective, prospects and building out their account list and ultimately growing their pool, or it's, nurture campaigns with marketing outreach and things like that. So obviously you want to ensure that whoever you're outreaching to, the data is correct, but also that's the preferred method of outreach, right? That that you're going to get the engagement, you're going to get the connect rate. So our biggest value prop is just making sure that saying, hey, let's maximize that connect rate and whatever engagement channel you're ultimately looking out to. So that's exactly what YourICP does. And hopefully we're here to help everybody out today.
Great. And what are some of the most common data quality issues that you see in CRMs that quietly break AI performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when trying to maximize your AI efficiencies, right? And obviously we're going through this evolution of, going from direct engagements to digitalization and then ultimately to just mass scale. So it's the same issues that ultimately occur even in those engagements. So you're talking stale contact data, right? So people that have changed jobs over the course of, say, last week, over the past 6 months, 12 months, you get those false positives, right? Engaging with the wrong person at the wrong company, but ultimately using the eyeball test, it looks complete. You don't have that context, right? If you're missing behaviors or activity data in ensuring that saying, hey, are they in fact the decision maker? Are they engaging the right channel? And then ultimately duplicate records. I can't tell you how many times we've seen the time and time again where because you're not updating your CRM appropriately, you're actually duplicating the efforts and putting the same person in different nurture tracks based on those duplicate records with, let's say, incorrect data. So really, it's just exacerbating the problem. Obviously, with the rollout of CRMs and marketing automation tools and other go-to-market tools, say 10, 15 years ago, yeah, you still run into those issues, but obviously with AI, it's only exacerbating the problem. So really making sure that you're kind of honing in on those respective areas. And one thing that's incredibly important is that privacy data, right? Do you have the right consents? Do you have the ability to even reach out to that person, right? So knowing not only who to reach and how to reach out to them, but also, who not to reach out to, whether it's unsubscribed or things like that in the past. So you got to make sure that you're incorporating that into your outreach as well.
Nice. How clean does their CRM data have to be before it's actually useful for AI?
No, it's a great question. It doesn't have to be absolute perfection, right? When you're talking that initial outreach, when you're talking about 60% of your data, and again, really following those steps, making sure that you have the right, let's call it the class A fields, right? With your LinkedIn handles, with the right email addresses, the right phone numbers, right? So, when you're at 60%, you're producing a good amount of noise. If you're reaching those thresholds upwards of like 75, 85% on those critical data points, again, making sure that you've got those class A fields in place, but also making sure they get the right consent and opt-ins appropriately. If you're around 85%, you're usually pretty operational, right? You want to make sure that obviously leveraging that, those particular fields. It doesn't need to be every single, let's say company level field, but really as long as you're honed in on those and you have the right consent, you just want to make sure that you understand who the person is, understanding where they work, how they prefer to reach out, how they prefer to be engaged with. And then again, just making sure that that's solid. And once you reach that confidence level, you're doing pretty well.
Great. What are the highest impact data fields that teams should prioritize when they're cleaning their CRM?
Yeah, especially when you're talking in the context of B2B, right? So obviously making sure you have the right email address that's tied to that person, right phone number. We see a data deprecation year over year of roughly 30% just on those fields alone. When you're talking, if you're managing data sets of 100,000, a million and greater from that in terms of your prospects, you got to make sure you're really staying on the hygiene. So again, focus on those engagement fields. Again, making sure layer in the consent. And then of course, you're going further and further down of, full name, company, right context, the company firmographics. And then of course, if you have the activity data that goes along with it that you can reference to in terms of your personalized outreach, you want to make sure they're maximizing those as well.
I guess, what are some negative side effects, I guess, or outcomes if you do have some of these data cleansing issues? If you have
No.
bad quality data and you're feeding it into AI, like what's the worst that can happen here?
Well, I mean, the absolute worst that can happen is, again, if you don't have the right consents in place, right? So it's one thing when you are just spaghetti, you're just throwing everything against the wall, hoping something sticks. Especially when you're talking about the context of consent. If you're not using or you don't have the right fields and engagement captured, ultimately that could just be absolutely devastating, especially when you're talking about GDPR violations, right? So, one impact or one violation can cost you 3% of your global revenue. Not really a risk that you really want to be taking. So just making sure that, hey, starting small, making sure that you've got the right consent, and then of course layering in, right? Again, we're not talking rocket science. This isn't something that's any different than 10, 15 years ago. It's just that you need to make sure the right strategy, the right requirements in place. And again, with AI, it's fantastic if you're doing it right. It can be absolutely devastating if you're utilizing it the wrong way.
It makes a lot of sense. I guess, what does a true closed loop CRM system look like in practice?
No, I love that question. So when you're talking the centralization of your systems, right? And that closed loop in terms of the feedback, not only from the attributes and the activity data that you're capturing in terms of those outreach, whether it be with your AI tools, whether it be with your human engagements, but also making sure that you're feeding back into that system, right? So it's becoming that system of account learning. So understanding who the key players are, who are the influencers and the decision makers that actually help in terms of driving those outcomes. So making sure that you're capturing every outbound attempt that's generated. You're making sure that the updates are actually updating the underlying data. And then that's what triggers the next action, right? So obviously, again, we're talking quicker feedback loops, not just in terms of the engagements that are occurring, but also making sure that, hey, are we testing out new messaging? Are we testing out new tactics? What is different compared to what we did previously? So again, those closed loop feedbacks, and obviously, in terms of informing the system, are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. You just got to make sure that you're practicing what you preach, right? And that process is really being followed. Now, process is, what's the problem? What are the things that I'm ultimately solving for? And then it's, am I doing that via people, or if I'm doing that via the product, right? And products being the various tools in which you're doing. So as long as you're keeping those in check and you're always reverting back to refining your processes, that's exactly what it's going to lead to. So it's not just, hey, I'm going to be sending out 1,000 emails, right? I want to understand that, hey, I've learned from this persona at this company with this messaging, it converts at 3x better than it did last week, last month, last year. So again, because of the scale that you have, the quicker you're able to get those feedback loops into the system, again, it just helps your AI, tools and everything like that just react that much better. And again, those refinements are continuous for sure.
Yeah, so it's really a two-way street, right? So you recommend that sales and marketing teams are always feeding outcomes and recommendations back to the AI engine. What's the best way that, I guess, teams could work with AI to improve those models and effectiveness over time?
No, yeah, great question. So when you're talking, making sure the activities are being accounted for, and the way it's always funny over the years that I've been, helping out go-to-market teams, right? It's always seen that waterfall effect, not only just from the buyer's journey of saying, okay, well, I'm actively researching what capabilities or what solutions are out there on solving the problem that I'm looking for, right? It's that waterfall effect in terms of the handoff, right? So you're typically engaging with, let's say it's self-research, you're finding what's on the web, then you're engaging with a BDR, handoff to sales and obviously marketing, and then you go kind of through that cycle again. AI has completely blown that up, right? So the amount of self-research, I mean, again, 95% of your buyers already know what their shortlist is going to be before they're even reaching out to somebody. So you got to make sure that you're really honed in on exactly what engagements, what activities are ultimately occurring both within your domain obviously outside, right? So again, those channels has expanded. It's not just I'm going to a publisher's website and I'm learning about some sponsored content that's on there. Obviously, feeding into the LLMs, making sure that you're understanding more and more about your audiences, again, how they behave. But it's even more so that the teams are becoming even more blended. That's why you're seeing the operational teams, rather than just siloed operations between sales and RevOps, between marketing ops, those teams are really coming even closer and closer together, again, with the reduced overhead that you're seeing in terms of those engagements actually occurring compared to teams of 5, 10, 15 people. Let's call that even 5 years ago. You want to make sure that those engagements are really being effective in terms of feeding those outcomes that are going back into the system. So again, what the activities are ultimately doing, how does that properly inform your CRM, and just making sure they have the right attributes in place. And again, how is that all coming together? Is it still following the process? And then here's the next set of outcomes or outputs that you're ultimately putting out there for your prospects.
Great. And any other simple ways for teams to start capturing feedback without bringing in a ton of resources to do so?
Yeah, again, it's all about standardization, right? The more structure you put into your engagements, the easier it is ultimately to feed into your AI prompts, into the agents that are ultimately engaging at scale, right? So standardizing how it is you're capturing your call dispositions, making sure you have the right amount of required fields on there. Again, you're hearing about this, like gated content is really starting to become a thing of the past, but at the same time, you want to have at least one or two pieces of information around around the people that are ultimately engaging with your content. So you don't need 15 fields. You don't necessarily need 10 different custom questions that are being required on the form, right? You may need 1, 2, or 3, again, just to get the proper amount of context. Now, again, there's always that trade-off, right? It's understanding how it is that I'm ultimately engaging with my prospects, but also on the other side of it, in terms of the person that's actually getting their hands on that content, they want to actually make sure that's more relevant. I prefer more relevant content versus something that's just kind of a piece to the masses. So making sure you're simplifying your dropdowns, you're standardizing your fields, making sure that all those syncs are coming in from your Outlook, Google, whatever, email or ESP they're ultimately leveraging, making sure it's feeding back into the system, and maximizing native integrations. There are so many of these tools right now, and especially more from an an API approach, configuration, just to make sure that those systems are connected. So it makes it much simpler for people to be able to say, okay, let me connect these particular attributes that are feeding in from system A that is going into system B, and just making sure that everything's connected appropriately. It doesn't necessarily require a whole lot of engineering power. There's a lot of, just basic connections that you could ultimately make that can be incredibly powerful for your teams. Even just getting 3 to 5 of those channels that are ultimately feeding into it can really get yourself set up for success.
And what are your thoughts on personalization and marketing today? Is it more important than ever before? Because, I mean, everybody's using automation. A lot of marketing's gotten really impersonal. Do you feel like that's kind of a key advantage that companies can have, is utilizing their data effectively to personalize their campaigns?
There's a fine line between personalization and not, right? You could personalize the emails, and I get these all the time where it's, hey, saw you went to Boston University. Awesome that you were in Warren Hall. You were in Warren Towers. I'm like, time out, buddy. I don't need you to necessarily go in and figure out exactly where I used to live in college. It's really primarily based on how is it that I'm guiding my messaging around the problem. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? What is it that are the pain points that you ultimately feel in whatever solution that you're trying to find? Now, granted, that messaging has to be really guided toward each one of those various personas within the organization, right? You're seeing that the engagement or the buying teams are continuing to increase, right? You're getting more of that collaboration amongst people within the organization and the leadership team to be able to identify and say, okay, well, this is a nugget that's going to be good for the CTO, but it may not necessarily be the right person for sales, right? Or the person in marketing. What you want to make sure is the personalized messaging is really honed in on whatever the function of that person, how they contribute to the role. Is that tool not just for the purposes of the end user and what is the goal that they're ultimately trying to accomplish, but how does that impact the rest of the people within the buying committee? So you have to make sure that your personalized messaging is really based on Am I honed on the right persona? So again, the message I talk to sales, the message I talk to the tech guy, they're going to be different. But at the end of the day, if you can find that common thread across all the different needles in which you're trying to put that through, that's what's absolutely crucial. So personalized messaging, yes. However, it needs to be put into the right context.
Yeah, that's a great point. Don't do it just for the sake of doing it, just to look like
100%.
you're faking like you know the person and you really don't.
Yeah.
People can really smell that out these days.
Oh, 100%. And granted, there are always different tactics and A/B tests that you can throw out there in terms of eye-catching, let's say subject lines, just to get the person to open the email. And there's one to say, hey, saw that you didn't open my email, whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's more FOMO or again, just something that's eye-catching just to get the email to open. Again, there's different ways of being able to do it. But again, as long as you're honed in on the root of the problem and you're honed in on the right messaging, you're gonna win every time.
Great. I guess what signals or events are the most valuable to track to make AI continuously smarter?
Yeah, I think that because there's so many different paths and different channels in which prospects can engage, right? So within the walled garden of your first party domain versus what's happening outside, right? And what are those additional signals that I'm getting out there? But even outside of that, again, you're talking the human to connection. So what connects am I actually having with that person in real life, whether it be at, hey, we're grabbing coffee, to hey, I happen to see you on the floor of this event in San Francisco, whatever the case may be. So those signals being, hey, if I'm outreaching and doing my outbound on email and phone, making sure you the right connect versus no connects, right? What are the positive versus the negative replies? Am I ultimately booking those meetings, and what are the outcomes that are actually coming into that? So it's making sure, again, that you're standardizing the data, making sure that in each of the engagement channels that they're ultimately occurring, but also, again, identifying those disqualification reasons, right? Again, because these feedback loops are increasingly faster that are ultimately feeding into your AI tools, you got to make sure that, again, what's good, what's not, where can we make those refinements? And then obviously making sure that how is it that I'm feeding into that system, and also the role validations, right? Making sure I'm actually talking to the right person that's a part of the buying, not just saying the buying committee, but are actually a part of the buying process, right? Whether you're the ultimate decision maker, whether you're a part of the committee, whether you're an end user, you got to make sure that those roles are ultimately validated. So going through that, but again, making sure that's the wrong person, not necessarily always being overly negative, but making sure that feedback loop has to be, those data points really have to be fed back into that system.
Yep. And do AI systems ever really struggle with unstructured CRM notes? I feel like a lot of people aren't really good at keeping notes from meetings and keeping their data hygiene aligned. Do you find like AI has any issues with that, or is AI a great tool for filling in the gaps?
I don't know what you're talking about. I think salespeople, they all do the same thing, right? So obviously we see where one rep will say, hey, that person's not interested, when somebody within maybe having the same exact conversation and say, hey, we're going to circle back in a quarter, or there's definitely interest. There's so much subjectivity that comes into it. Now, granted, LLMs, you need to be able to take the subjectivity and make it objective, right? So ensuring that, hey, how is it that I am taking the notes, taking the right context? Hey, I will be on, out of every 10 calls that I'm on, 9 of them, there's at least one person that has an AI note taker. And so always comparing the notes in those sessions against each other is always really interesting. So taking what I am saying, how I'm portraying it, how I'm saying it, and that's a big thing too. It's not always what you say, it's how you say it, right? So if you can understand those nuances, and a lot of the LLMs don't necessarily pick that up because they're looking at just the base text of what was actually said on the call. So if you're actually taking the emotional piece along with it as well, that ultimately feeding into it, yes, you got to make sure that you're structuring as much as you can. So there is a little bit of that struggle, right? It's saying missed or misaligned words or whatever the case may be. So tools are getting better. AI is certainly getting better, and how it is that's feeding into it. But again, that's where humans are still going to continue to intervene, especially as we're talking here, right? I can be off camera, I can be saying the same thing, but my facial expressions could be saying something completely different. So I think as those emotional recognitions and regulations ultimately come into play, I think it will ultimately make it even better. But again, structure over unstructured. But again, you can make the unstructured into structure and getting that in place.
Yeah, we're still really in the second inning, so
Oh
long
yeah.
ways to go there. What's the right balance between structured fields and freeform notes for managing your CRM notes?
Yeah, I mean, again, the structured data really equates to that decision making. The unstructured data, you want to be able to leverage that for your context and nuances, right? So, hey, what is the one-off thing that makes this particular engagement unique compared to, just the same old white bread that you're typically going to see. So, again, making sure that you're taking what you can that's unstructured. If you're starting to see common elements amongst the unstructured data, then it gives you pause and say, okay, how is it that I can standardize this particular set of data in order to make it a part of the process? And again, feed into your LLMs and ultimately into your AI tools. So again, by turning those unstructured into structured, it impacts your routing, it impacts the persona and the personalization and the messaging, and it ultimately impacts your AI workflows. Because again, you want to make sure that you're putting the right rules and paths in place along, so those AI tools can ultimately say, hey, what is the right path that this person needs to go down based on that structured data? And again, there's always going to be that, let's call it 5-10% of nuance that you certainly want to account for. So again, just making sure that you're keeping within that 10% of your nuances that will account to say, this is really what set this particular engagement apart from something else.
Great. Is there a way that teams can really operationalize turning these messy notes into structured, usable data at scale?
Yeah. So make sure that you're really taking out those, extracting the key signals from the notes, making sure that you're actually mapping them into the structured fields, right? So again, as we're talking, hey, this may not be the right fit or this may not be the right time, right? Those are two very different things that you ultimately want to say, okay, well, let's route this person to saying, hey, we're going to disqualify them, but it may just be at that particular point. It doesn't mean that it's not necessarily going to happen in the future. So you want to make sure that you're informing the right path for that particular prospect and or account that's going to go into that system. And then ultimately, again, what is the feed that's going back into your system? So you're turning language into labels. That's really, really, really where you want to help operationalize those notes and actually create some structure around it.
Great. Where do you see CRMs evolving over the next few years, especially with all the new AI tools and capabilities?
Yeah, it's funny because I love seeing a lot of people that are, whether it's leveraging Claude or Gemini in terms of creating more so vibe coding, right? So there's let's call it the behemoths, if you will, or the monoliths of, those CRM companies and marketing automation tools. There's a lot of flexibility that teams now have in terms of creating these tools that enable them to really be able to hone in on exactly what their value prop, how it is that they actually customize their tools for their particular process. But I think I see this more of being at the ultimately those systems becoming more structured at the core. A lot of people leverage CRMs as the core source of truth for everything that they're doing. Not to say that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but really what you want to try to do is to say, okay, how is it that I'm creating these data hubs and saying, okay, how is it that I have the various inputs that are coming in from not just the engagement data or the customer related data, but how is it that I'm taking product data and I'm merging that together? How is it that I'm taking all these other engagements and all these other tools and kind of compiling that all together to really give me that sense of understanding around my prospects and my accounts, and not even just my, the accounts that I'm going after, but also the accounts in which I currently have in place, right? So how is it that I'm cross-selling, upselling into various accounts? How is it that I need to have the variances? When do I need to ultimately incorporate those touch points? So I really think that, hey, the CRM is ultimately should be more structured. And then what's the layer of AI or the tools that I'm putting on top of that in order to maximize my outreach?
So what type of companies does your ICP work best with? What would be a good signal for a company that they need to sign up and try your service today?
Oh, I love that. So your ICP being that trust layer, right? So our core value props are making sure that, hey, get your house clean first. making sure that, hey, let me get all of my data cleaned up. Let me get an understanding of the context that have been sitting in my CRM for the past 5, 10, 15 years. Let me get my house in order first. But then it's the buck doesn't stop there, right? Once I get my house in order, there's constant maintenance, right? Hey, I got to change the air filters on my central layer. The same thing applies with your CRM. So get your data up to snuff first within your existing platform. And then it's okay, let me make sure that whatever data is ultimately continuing to come into my system, that it is clean and verified. So that's really where we sit at the core of saying we work really well with the CRMs. We work really well with marketing automation tools and obviously the outreach tools that in terms of that engagement, because again, contextually relevant and contextually clean data is ultimately what's going to allow you to scale. But even before, as you're testing out new data partners, as you're testing out new sources, testing out new channels, your own first party forms that are ultimately coming in, you want to make sure that you don't want to muddy up your existing, that CRM that you just spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money cleaning up. You got to make sure that any of those inroads are ultimately still being cleaned up. So that's where we sit, right? Again, we just want to make sure that we're that filtration system between the data source in which you're engaging with and making sure that it's not muddying up the waters in terms of maximizing those go-to-market tools.
Yep. And I guess what's next for a company? Anything exciting that you're working on, which we expect over the next few years? Obviously, stuff that you could share with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So really, we're looking at how is it that we are, again, not only helping marketing ops, revenue ops, go-to-market operations teams and making sure that their house is cleaned up in order. How is it that we are helping identify what's the right data source, right? Again, the entire name of our company is YourICP. It's not my ICP, it's yours. So understanding, making sure that, hey, how is it that based on the engagements, what it is I'm actually seeing within my CRM, how that data is ultimately feeding into the respective tools. How is it that I'm learning from those behaviors, from those engagements to best inform and say, hey, look, your ICP in which you assumed was actually going to be in this bucket, actually maybe within it's actually going to be this particular group of end users, of decision makers. It's expanding on that reach, right? So how is it we're identifying the total addressable market for your ICP in the various data sources that we're tapped into, and how is it that I'm refining that dial, right? So layering in technographic data, layering behavioral signals, both at the account and at the individual level, and make sure that's feeding in. So, I mean, it could go a million different ways. Again, with what's coming out into market, it's really kind of putting a finger to the wind right now, but it's how is it we're guiding, again, that messaging and again, that persona, how is it you're creating content based on data? How is it that you're actually creating new environments on the web, or in terms of that messaging, it's saying, hey, I want to engage with that person at the right time, understanding that customized, personalized sequences based on your behavior. So it's great when you have a one size fits all in terms of send a white paper, make a phone call, hit them on LinkedIn. Fantastic. Every person is different, right? So you want to make sure that you're creating those sequences, and how is it that we're engaging with those sales engagement tools that are out there. So there's a lot to be said, of course, with what AI has been doing over the past 6-12 months. Who knows what it can look like in the next, 3, 4, 5 years with how quickly, the technologies that are available, what ultimately can look like. But at the end of the day, people trust people. So you still got to make sure that there's still that human element, that human connection point that's ultimately happening, but just making sure that eliminating as much of the noise as possible, putting that in that content and giving that person the ability to go and do as much research as they want to. And ultimately, at the end of the day, how is it that I'm ultimately helping those people out? So that's really where we see that. So we're going to be ultimately helping empower the decisions that are actually being put into those systems, and how it is that we're really shielding people. So really exciting stuff on what we got coming up over the next couple of years, to say the least.
Well, it sounds like people are leaving a lot of revenue on the table if they're not using your platform. So,
where
can people learn more
100%.
about?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to youricp.com to learn more about our products and obviously our services. Or if you want to go to the app, so it's app.youricp.com. It's a self-service platform. You actually go there and conduct a free data hygiene analysis that'll actually enable you to say, hey, whether it's let me take a look at a subset of data that I have within my CRM, or I'm testing on a new data source before I go and upload that into my CRM. Let me get a kind of a first pass first. Go into our platform, upload your data. It's really simplistic. And then you'll get a free data hygiene analysis. So it'll give you a look to say, hey, what's good? What needs fixing? And hey, there's some data that you actually got to remove from your data set. Why don't you go and kick that out? So always here. And yeah, Andy, it's always a pleasure. And yeah, anything else that we can certainly do to help in terms of clean data, definitely here for support.
Great. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you coming on today. For anybody listening, go to youricp.com. Check it out today. We also have it. We're proud partners of YourICP. We do other product in the NachoNacho marketplace as well. Again, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on today. I feel like people are leaving money on the table if they're not using a system like this. It's really about personalization and having the right context when you're engaging with your clients today to be able to close more deals. So again, thanks for coming on today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks again, Andy. Appreciate it.